Earlier this year, Tucker Carlson interviewed Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. Putin spent much of that interview giving his version of the history of Ukraine.
What is happening is, to a certain extent, an element of a civil war. Everyone in the West thinks that the Russian people have been split by hostilities forever. They will be reunited.
So, just what is the history of Ukraine? Is it an invention, as Vladimir Putin suggested, or is it a reality with its own distinctive national identity? Putin's claim is that Ukraine is inherently Russian territory. That's a claim that requires two pieces of support. First, the idea that Ukraine is historically Russian-controlled and Russian-populated, and second, that Ukraine, today, has no claim to its independence. Let's see whether either of these claims stands up to scrutiny. Vladimir Putin begins his history lesson in 862 with the townspeople of Novgorod, an oblast in Russia today, inviting a Varangian Prince Rurik from Scandinavia to reign. The Varangians were Viking warrior traders. Rurik's successor, Prince Oleg, came to Kiev in 882, proclaiming it the capital of Kievan Rus. Approximately 100 years later, Vladimir the Great introduced and adopted Eastern Orthodoxy across his realm. This is Putin's history, and this part is certainly true. As we can see here, the territory of Kievan Rus spanned some of today's Russia, today's Belarus, and some of today's Ukraine. It did not include either the Donbas region or Crimea. But Kievan Rus fell apart in the 11th and 12th centuries, breaking into a series of principalities. And in the 13th century, Kievan Rus was overrun by the Mongols, with Kiev destroyed. In 1349, Poland and Lithuania essentially partitioned the territory now known as Ukraine. It was during this period that Ukrainian began to develop as a separate language. It was a combination of Slavonic, Ruthenian, and Polish, with words from Turkic languages as well. In 1569, the Polish and Lithuanian governments formed the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, combining their holdings and making them one of the most powerful kingdoms in all of Europe. They ruled over much of modern Ukraine, although again, not over the Donbas region or Crimea. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth came into conflict with the Ottoman Empire, which had expanded well into Europe in this period. That conflict was exacerbated by the militaristic activities of the Cossacks, who occupied Zaporizhia, what would now be southeastern Ukraine. The Cossacks were a militaristic and aggressive warrior population, and eventually they turned against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and launched a series of uprisings against it, seeking independence, also in the process slaughtering enormous numbers of Jews. Led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky, the Cossacks eventually asked for the help of the Russian government to fight the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and then the Cossacks declared their loyalty to the Tsar. In 1654, the uprising eventually established a Cossack state called the Hetmanate, located on both sides of the Dnieper River, constituting the broad center of modern-day Ukraine. After a 30-year struggle with their neighbors, however, the Hetmanate came to an end in 1686, when the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth signed a treaty with the Russians to divide the land at the Dnieper River. The Russians increasingly claimed sovereignty over Cossack lands. During the reign of Catherine the Great, who ruled from 1762 to 1796, Russia simply swallowed much of central Ukraine and Belarus, annexed Crimea, and instituted a policy of Russification, suppressing the use of the Ukrainian language, among other measures. Western Ukraine was partitioned between Russia and the Habsburg Empire after the end of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1795. For the next century and a quarter, the Russian government worked to suppress Ukrainian nationalism. That culminated in an 1863 circular from Interior Minister Pyotr Valiev stating a separate little Russian language, which is how he referred to the Ukrainian language, quote, never existed, does not exist, and shall not exist. And then, an 1876 decree from Tsar Alexander II banning Ukrainian in print. That didn't stop the rise of Ukrainian nationalism, and in the aftermath of World War I, civil war broke out in Ukraine, with the Central Rada, the government, proclaiming Ukrainian autonomy in June of 1917. The Ukrainian People's Republic was established on November 20th, 1917. But the Communist Party of Ukraine quickly set up a rival fighting force, with the Bolsheviks seizing the offensive. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed by the UPR and the Central Powers in February 1918, with Germany and Austria promising military support for the UPR against the Bolsheviks. And indeed, the German Austro-Hungarian Empire expelled the Bolsheviks from Ukraine. A second treaty of Brest-Litovsk was then signed between the Bolsheviks and the Central Powers, ending hostilities on the Eastern Front and promising recognition of the UPR. That didn't work. After a series of coups and counter-coups in Ukraine, the situation was finally ended by the Bolshevik re-invasion of Ukraine in 1919. The Ukrainian government appealed to the Polish government, a former enemy, but their combined forces were then defeated by the Russians. The situation ended with the Treaty of Riga, in which Poland retained some of modern Ukraine and Belarus, while Russia retained control over the rest. We'll get to more of this in just 1 second. First, for the 5th consecutive year, abortion remains the world's leading cause of fetus mortality, even despite the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Tragically, it's been reported that the number of infant deaths caused by abortion is greater than the number of deaths attributed to the next 7 causes of death combined. Preborn is leading the charge to turn this around. Every day, Preborn's network of clinics rescues 200 unborn babies. By introducing a mom to her child via ultrasound, a baby's chance of survival could double. Preborn's work has only begun. By the time I finish this life-saving message, 2 unborn babies will be aborted in this country. Will you join Preborn and make 2024 the biggest baby-saving year in history? One ultrasound is just $28, $140 will offer 5 babies a chance at life. Just dial pound 250 and say keyword baby. That's pound 250 baby. Or donate securely at preborn.com/Ben. That's preborn.com/Ben. Start saving babies today. Dial pound 250 and say keyword baby, or go to preborn.com/Ben. While Ukraine was given titular national position in the newly created USSR, Ukraine was then subjected to Russian predations, including the Holodomor, that is the forced collectivization and subsequent starvation of nearly 4 million people under Stalin. At the same time, Ukrainian nationalists under Polish rule continued to chafe at their lack of independence. Under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 between the Nazis and the Soviets, the partition of Poland between the Nazis and Russians ended with parts of Poland incorporated into Ukraine. Ukrainians generally fought with the Red Army against the Nazis after the invasion of the USSR by Hitler in 1941, although there were a smaller number of independent nationalists who engaged in alliances with the Nazis against the Soviets and also engaged in massacres of Poles as well in an attempt to pursue ethnic homogeneity in the region. After the war in 1954, the Soviet Union transferred control of Crimea to Ukraine as well. In 1991, the USSR broke up and Ukraine declared itself an independent country with the borders that we are all familiar with. Those borders of Ukraine were essentially set until 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and occupied the Donbas region. So as you can see, the history of the region, pretty complicated. A lot of moving borders, a lot of territorial claims. But Putin claims that because Ukraine's borders have moved over time, because its territory and population was divided repeatedly, because Russia occupied some parts of Ukraine for some swaths of time, this means Ukraine has never existed, that it is in fact a figment of the imagination, that it is indeed an integral part of Russia. But this is simplifying something that's really complex, as we've seen. As Matthew Leno, associate professor of history at the University of Rochester, says, quote, when Putin says this is the heritage of these 3 Slavic peoples, in one sense, he's not wrong. But there's no continuous line to be traced from this loose river confederation of the Kievan Rus to the Russian state. And there's also no continuous line to be traced from this loose confederation to the Ukrainian state. This tension has created just enough ambiguity, allowing Putin to propagandize Ukraine's backstory. But here is something absolutely clear. The Ukrainians, while recognizing their historic ties to Russia, do not, as a whole, want to be part of Russia. They wish to retain their independence from Russia. Even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, 64% of Ukrainians considered themselves citizens of Ukraine rather than citizens of the broader region. In the aftermath of the war, that number jumped to 85%. It is important to say, by the way, that this was not true in Crimea. Even before the Russian annexation of that region in 2014, Crimeans widely preferred annexation to Russia in lieu of maintaining status in Ukraine. The same is also true in many separatist areas of the Donbas region. In other words, life and borders are complicated. So is Ukraine. But the Putin argument for the invasion of Kyiv and the dissolution of Ukraine as an independent entity are not only wrong historically, they are highly likely to lead to continued bloodshed and warfare in the region.